My name is Andrew Patterson. I work at the Dorset Environmental Science Centre. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Sean Watmough from Trent University, Judy asked that I talk a little bit about the Canadian Water Research Consortium, Canadian Water Network project that many in this room are involved with. So let me step back a little bit. I'll step back to the end of 2010, or 2010. That's when the Canadian Water Network introduced a new funding opportunity. This is called the Canadian Watershed Research Consortium, or Consortium. And among the many things it was intended to do, it was intended to provide local support. So support really at the scale of the watershed. So for example, the Muskoka River watershed would be an example of that. Where they, with new money, they could promote research for looking at how multiple stressors affect lakes and streams in the watershed, and how we can better manage for what we might call cumulative effects. And I know it's early in the evening, maybe too early to use a word like cumulative effects or a phrase like that, so let me just talk a little bit about how we might define that as a group. We can talk about changes to the environment that are caused by an action, but in combination with past, present, or other future human actions. And we might imagine two types of that. We might think about maybe multiple insults of the same stress, so a few cottages on a lake, and then over time a few more and a few more. We might call that a cumulative effect. Or perhaps multiple stressors acting in concert, or a few stressors, acid rain, the cottages, in the context of a changing climate, for example. And so what I think CWN recognized is that we do a fairly good job of managing perhaps single stressors. You think about, although very complex issue, think about perhaps acid rain, where we can manage SO2 or sulfur dioxide emissions, and then we begin to see improvements. But trying to manage that particular stressor in the context of other stressors is much more difficult. And so the support was to try and build frameworks and monitoring tools to try and understand and manage cumulative effects. The second thing that CWN wanted to do was really turn the whole funding model on its head and to have the lead at the local scale, so that the questions were coming from local stakeholders, local politicians, and the people who live within the watershed, rather than having, say, academics or research scientists build the questions and then try and get that funded. And so out of this came one node here, the Muskoka River Watershed Consortium node, one of only 7 or 8 watersheds that were funded across the country. So the local stakeholders and politicians, with also getting feedback from the public, they held workshops to do that, began to build a call for proposals. And they were looking for a number of things. One was some kind of enhanced monitoring program that could really look at these cumulative effects. Benchmarks, we look at often chemical things like water quality, but also biological benchmarks in which we can measure change in streams and lakes. Maybe new models that will allow us to predict future change in for example, change as a result of different stressors in the context of a changing climate. And trying to integrate this science, this is of course a difficult task that we're involved with, but trying to integrate these tools, these new tools, into something that would work in terms of management at the local scale. So integrated into local planning, development decisions, and then with communication and translating this back to the public. So a team was put together who responded to this call for proposals. It includes Dr. Watmough is here, and myself, and many others are in the room. And so it's 6 universities, and also the Dorset Environmental Science Centre is involved, and many talented postdocs and students. Carolyn Reed is here, Dr. Watmough's student, who's involved with the project. What we call the Managing Cumulative Effects in the Muskoka River Watershed Monitoring Research and Predictive Modeling. And really you can think of it as 3 broad areas that try to address this call for proposals. So we recognize that there are still some key knowledge gaps that have to be filled. That's an important part of it. We need to, because this is really the focus of CWN, we have to come up with an improved or enhanced design for monitoring locally to try and understand cumulative effects. And perhaps develop some new tools, perhaps some of these predictive models for looking at change perhaps in the future. For example, there's a project beginning to look at, can we predict whether or not algal blooms may occur in the future? Those kinds of projects. I don't want you to read these, there are many here, but just to show you that those three broad themes broaden into 11 unique projects in 9 research areas. And again, with many talented students and postdocs involved. And one of these is the one that Dr. Watmough is involved with, tonight's speaker, harvesting intensities to sustain critical calcium levels. He's going to talk a little bit about that work and other related work in a talk on timber harvesting and the health of our lakes, the calcium story. So Dr. Watmough I've known for several years now, and he's worked in the watershed for about a decade. And Dr. Watmough did his PhD at Liverpool John Moores University, working on plant stress physiology, and now an associate professor at Trent in Environmental Resource Science program. And he continues to focus on this ecosystem, environmental stress, but his work really crosses many disciplines. So he's worked in the discipline of biogeochemistry, forest ecology, forestry. He's worked on issues of air pollution, climate change, and many other issues. As I said, he's worked on projects and on research in the watershed itself over the past decade, really looking at calcium decline in Muskoka lakes. And the part that Dr. Watmough is very well known for is looking at the consequences of timber harvesting and how that can impact calcium levels in lakes. And I think that will partly be the focus of his talk tonight. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Sean Watmough from Trent University.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a very nice introduction. I didn't recognize myself. The photograph's a bit old. Anyway, not as much glare. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to at least entertain and inform you for the next 45 minutes, that you go away with a better understanding of the issue that Andrew raised, that was specifically understanding how and why calcium levels in lakes are changing, and then from that knowledge trying to think ahead and come with some ideas about what may happen in the future, and how may timber harvesting as one land use change that occurs, how that will impact calcium levels in lakes. So the whole issue is very complicated in some ways, but at another level it's quite simple. And I know the audience comes from a multitude of backgrounds. I also have a little accent, I've been told. Although at dinner time, Judy said I've almost lost it. So I am Canadian now, so A for sure. I can talk and you'll hopefully all understand me. I entertain questions at any point, I don't mind. I'm going to try and keep it at a level that is good for everybody. And my sole objective at the end of this talk is that when I leave today, you will all know the answers to these questions. And it's on the exam. That you didn't really know about. We're going to give it to you, and you can't leave until you take the exam. And the first one is just, well, why should we care about calcium? You don't even know what calcium is. What's the big deal, right? So I'll try and convince you that we should care about calcium. And the second level is, well, okay, I care about it. How are levels in lakes and soils and plants changing? What evidence do we have for those changes? And if we see changes, well, what is causing those changes? Why are calcium levels in lakes changing? If we understand that, then we can start to make projections, do modelling, and inform management decisions. At the end, I'll start to address, which is Carolyn's project, and she's in the second row here. One of the things we're trying to address now is if you harvest sites, what impact on lake calcium levels will that have? And we've done theoretical approaches before, but we've not attempted to actually put it on the landscape, knowing how variable harvesting is. So what we're trying to do is do that, and as best we can answer that question. That's work in progress. What I'm going to do in that sense is talk through the approach, and I'll give you an hypothetical scenario that will at least put it into context in terms of the type of things that we may see. And there's always uncertainties. I mean, any scientist will always tell you always have that, because you're always thinking about the next funding source, right? And if you answer the questions, then you basically make yourself unemployed. So you don't want to do that, right? So you always, any project raises new questions. That way you can apply for new money and train new students who go out in the world and do a much better job than I will ever do. So the first question is, why should we care about calcium? You've all walked through the forest, but you've never walked through the forest and looked at the forest the way I do. I just see calcium. I see nothing else, right? So you guys might be looking at animals, at plants, at trees, at soil. I'm just looking at calcium. And if I'm looking through my calciocentric there's no such word, but I've just made it up. My calciocentric eyes at the forest, this is what I see. I see, look, bark on my trees, 3% by mass is calcium. If I look at the wood, about 1.1% of that is calcium. Forest floor, 1%. Eggs, 30% are calcium. There's a lot of calcium in the environment. Biota, vegetation, animals, we all need calcium. You know that. You've been told it since you were a kid. Have a glass of milk. It's good for your bones. The natural environment's no different. We need a lot of calcium. It is an essential nutrient. You know, if you care, you could go on, there's lots of studies if you dig around the literature, but there are things that you may not be aware of in terms of the consequences. Studies in Hubbardbrook, this is the forest floor, the litter. If they look at snail abundance, you'll see that the idea is if you have more calcium in the environment, more snails. Not surprising. Snails need a lot of calcium. If you have sites that have a lot of calcium, you are providing conditions that will support their growth. So from an ecological point of view, calcium demanding species will only thrive in conditions where there are lots of calcium. If you don't have much calcium, then those species will be at risk. So if you can take the same site and you change the calcium levels over time, you are putting animals, plants at risk. I'm not going to talk too much about, the focus is lakes, so I'm going to really try and talk about lakes, but I just want to talk a little bit about trees, and again, with that, put Ontario into perspective. A lot of researchers, and this all started with the acid rain story about Volksturban, forest decline, and trying to understand what was causing it, and it turned out there are many causes and they kind of contributed. But one of the underlying themes with that is that when calcium levels in trees become low, in itself that won't kill a tree. What you'll tend to do is just weaken its stress response, its immune response if you like, and they tend to become more vulnerable to other stresses. So a lot of work, for example, in the Appalachians with red spruce decline, the reason red spruce declined and not balsam fir, for example, the idea is, well, the low calcium level predisposes them to frost effects. And it just so happens that red spruce has a lower tolerance to frost than balsam fir. So when you got these cold events, because you had low calcium, the red spruce were less able to survive those cold. So it was the cold, these frost events that were killing the trees, but they were predisposed to that because of having low calcium. A lot of work has been done on sugar maple forest, particularly in Pennsylvania, for example, where dieback has been attributed and forest death to low calcium levels. And again, oftentimes it's not the calcium itself that causes trees to die. Oftentimes the tree death occurs from defoliation. And they compared stands that were defoliated by gypsy moth, and then they looked back, and the stands that had high calcium recovered, the stands that didn't, they didn't recover. So again, oftentimes you have this notion that calcium itself is an essential element. In itself, as you lose calcium, that won't necessarily cause huge impacts on the forest. It just predisposes them to other stresses. And this is what Andrew talked about a little bit, this notion of cumulative effects. And so when you're looking at impacts on forests, if you were going that way, it does get rather more complicated. Just a couple of slides here, which kind of shows them where our forests stand in relation to these. A lot of the work that really has related to, and I've chosen sugar maple just because of its dominance in the forest around here. And I've done a lot of work on sugar maple. And in parts of the Allegheny, it's a bit unusual geologically. The soils around here are about 10,000 years old. So that's relatively young for a soil. I know some of us will think, well, that's old. But for a soil, that's very young. And so there are a lot of primary minerals in these soils that over time are breaking down and releasing calcium into the soil. In Pennsylvania, you have this unusual geology, and when the last glaciers came up, a part of Pennsylvania, the glaciers never covered, they left it open. So those soils are very old, because glaciers just reset the system. They just scour everything away, and when they're going back, they deposit till, which is basically what is the basis of the soil, and then through succession and plant development, you start to develop a soil on that till. in Pennsylvania, you have very old soils because the glacier never reset the system, and all those primary minerals are gone and the calcium levels are really low. So when they looked at stands, they said, oh, the declining stands all had very, very low calcium levels. Those that had a little bit more, there's not that much difference between these. These tend to be have a little bit higher calcium. And again, don't worry about the units, just think that this is a half and this is 1. Don't worry about these units. So this study suggests if you have less calcium in soil, you tend to have poorer stands. That was just, I think, 10 stands. They then extended it across from Pennsylvania, across northeastern United States, and instead of looking at soil in this case, they were looking at foliar calcium. And again, if you go to the doctors, it's exactly the same. They'll take your blood sample to get a good indication of your health. A good way of looking at the health of a tree is to take its foliar chemistry, because that's where all its active processes occur. That's where photosynthesis occurs. It's very important to a leaf, to a plant, that its leaves are functioning properly. Calcium is a big component of that. Is that if you, as calcium levels go down, this is crown vigor, and these are typically assessed by just looking at canopy condition, dieback, fine branches, size of leaves, colour of leaves, etc. Different agencies assess crowns differently. But again, the idea is, once you get to some kind of threshold, about 5,000–6,000 parts per million, you start to see this increase in poor crown condition. So, the notion that if you lose calcium from soils, that's reflected in foliage, and you get poorer stands. So in Ontario, I've done a lot of work and sampled lots of stands in Ontario, and if you look across stands in general, first of all, remember soils in Pennsylvania, the number was 1/2 to 1, right? That's how much calcium there was in the soil. Here we're going all the way up to 20. Way more calcium in many of these stands. And over a large range of these conditions, you get no difference in foliar calcium. So from here to here, basically you just get back and forth. There's no relationship between calcium and leaf. Basically, trees have all the calcium they need. Everything is fine. However, if you just zoom in a little bit on this area here, this is just the zone. You start to see, and this is that 1/2 to 1, right? And you start to see that there are a few stands now in this region, 35, so actually I have more now, but the same thing holds. That are a few stands that are starting to get to this very low level, and these are also approaching this low calcium, 5,000–6,000. So even though across the region, most of our stands are, in terms of calcium, there's lots of them around, there are some stands that are currently at levels that, based on research in other parts, would be deemed sort of at a critical level. This, of course, is what we currently see. And my concern, or our concern, is, well, what's going to happen in the future? How are these levels going to change, and what are the implications for forest? But in terms of forest, that's where I'm going to stop. That's for another day. I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk on lakes and surface waters, or the impacts, or potential impacts. Now, I think as Andrew said,
what is the critical threshold that you're looking at?
In the literature, they'll say once you have foliar calcium less than about 6,000 parts per million, that is and that is deemed insufficient. That would be what you'd see. Some people will say 7,000. It depends on studies in Quebec. There's a lot of studies in Quebec doing the same thing, and they will say it's a little bit high. They'll say it's about 7,000. But you're talking about that range.
0.6%.
Yes. Okay. Yes, because 10,000, just put it beside it, 10,000 parts per million is 1%. No, I'll try. Anyway, sometimes you can get scooped. It's not really getting scooped, but it's kind of, sometimes you've got to be creative, you've got to be more creative in the way you put things forward. So I've been working in my own little world, doing my own little studies, looking at forest catchment budgets and understanding weathering and how calcium cycles, and saying, oh yeah, calcium's going down, and yeah, you know, not really getting too into, well, what will that mean for lakes? And then my pals here, Andrew and Norma are in there, and I think a few others might be on this paper probably. Pretty much everybody from Dorset's on here. And it's clever, and it was needed, and it's great, because, well, first of all, the Globe and Mail put this, Canadian Lakes suffer from an aquatic version of osteoporosis. right? And it was a good sort of marketing, and it made it visible that. And the observation was that calcium levels were going down. And I thought, well, I knew that, right? I mean, that's nothing new, right? But what they did is they regionalised it, just got me out of my little bubble from Muskoka, and linked it to a biological effect. I'd not done that, right? I wasn't looking at how this impacts biota. These guys were relating it to biota. And so all of a sudden it gets a lot of press, and as you talk to Norm, I do not profess to be, I mean that, sometimes I go to sleep and I think that's Norm if I had a beard. I don't know if it's a dream or a nightmare, I'm not sure. But anyway, in terms of Daphnia or zooplankton, he's the one I asked. But from my understanding of zooplankton, these guys, just like my forest, my calcium, these guys require a lot of calcium. And therefore, as the calcium levels in lakes go down, critters like Daphnia and certain species of Daphnia that require a lot of calcium don't do as well. And you'll start to affect the sort of zooplankton community, which, if anybody's done basic ecology, if you start to disrupt things at the bottom of the food chain or close to the bottom, that has potential consequences higher up. So that's where the concern is. So, you know, if you talk to Norm, he'll answer it. And not only that, and you asked me the question about the critical calcium level in forests, and I can give you that from what I know. The critical level for lakes, and from this I listen to people like Norm, and they will tell me it's somewhere around 1.5 to 1 milligram per litre, something like that, in that range. And again, it's a bit more complicated, because it's not necessarily just the calcium level itself, it can interact with other stresses, like climate warming. The idea if waters get warmer, then they're more vulnerable to low calcium. Or if UV light gets more intense, more vulnerable. Or if sodium from road salt gets into it, more vulnerable. So oftentimes these critical levels are, you know, there's some variability around them. The bottom line is, as calcium levels go down, you may lose these sensitive creatures because they need calcium, and that can affect the community. And just to show you what I mean, I snagged this from the paper. So this is Daphnia pulex. So it's not like, I mean, I know Norm's got a grey beard, but he's not been sampling since 1900. What happens is they get this stuff from sediments, and people like Andrew will tell you all about it. You can dig down a sediment core, and then you can get somebody who's very patient to sit under a microscope and count abundance, because the shells, the carapace, is preserved in sediments. And so you can, based on the community, this blue line represents the percentage of Daphnia going along, and then what you can see is it started to decline dramatically in this latter period, and that was coincidental with the decline in calcium. And so making the assumption that, well, these guys require a lot of calcium, as you're losing calcium, perhaps that is contributing to the change that's being observed. And this is just one lake, and I think it's much more widespread now with all the work that they've done. The other thing what declining calcium will do is, there's been literally billions of dollars spent in Canada and the US in terms of reducing acid rain, SO2. So if you compare acid deposition levels now to what they would have been in 1980, they're probably about a third of what they are in terms of sulfate deposition. And one of the expectancies is that if you reduce acid rain, then the acid lakes should recover. They should become less acidic. But in many cases, we've not seen that. And that's because if you look, what's happened here, if you follow this is the sulfate level in a lake going down. Lots of variations which are climbing, I'm not going to go there. But at the same time, calcium followed it all the way down. So it's like this thing here, which is analogous to pH, didn't change. So despite a huge reduction in acid deposition and acidity going into the lakes, the lake pH never improved because the buffering capacity of the catchment also went down. Less calcium was coming out of that system. So one consequence of lowering calcium is that you're not getting the recovery from acidity that you may hope for, which when politicians who are looking and say, well, what's the, you know, we spend all this money and our lakes still aren't recovering, what's going on, scientists? Come on, get your act together. Well, we're trying to. So really, that first part was the first question, and hopefully, and that's the longest, right? I know it's going to take me another 20 minutes. But I've tried to convince you that calcium is important for forests and aquatic systems, and for the rest of this talk I'm going to try and answer some of the whys and understand what's going on, what I've learned over the last decade or so, probably a bit longer than that. Well, first of all, we'll have an observation. We're lucky enough that we have the Ontario Ministry of Environment that's located in this area, and they monitor lots of different lakes and inflows, and a lot of the research that I do would not be possible without collaboration with people on the MOE in terms of logistics support sometimes, providing lots of data, and just helping sometimes interpret these data as well. So, and ultimately, it's only government agencies that can provide this kind of data. We're looking at data that's going from 1976 to present. An academic like myself from university, we get 3-year, 4-year, 2-year grants. That would be the length. That would be long term for our study. And really, a 3-year, 4-year window is not long enough to tell you anything about trends. But if you look at this, so these are a few of the A lakes, and we call them A lakes because they're Canadian. No, apparently not. It's not. They're not called A lakes because they're Canadian. It's because they get sampled more frequently than the others. So they tend to go out monthly during the ice-free season, and also when they got ice on. And the bottom line I'm showing you is that all the lakes inside this period were being about 2.5 milligrams per litre to almost 3.5. That's where we started. And the observation, this is where the Canadian Ocean Process started, was, well, look, what's happened? It's going down. Alright, so if you take this lake, it's now just over what? It's gone down by 50%. We've got about half as much calcium in some of these lakes as we had at the beginning of this period. Some lakes haven't gone down by anywhere near as much. This is Harp Lake, I believe, up here. It's not gone down as much. And there are other confounding issues that come in. I've removed one lake, Dickey Lake, because of dust suppressant and things like that, which kind of messes up the pattern. There are local sources. But the bottom line is, lake calcium levels are going down, and they can go down by anywhere as much as 50%. And these are representative lakes. They've not been chosen in any way, shape or form to be unusual. And these pretty much span the range of lake concentration that you'll see in the Muskoka watershed, as you will see.
Sean, just want to mention, if you took it up to 2011, 2012, I think we're probably up to 65% declines. And
yeah.
So it's continuing.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway. Foliage concentration, so again, through another branch of the Ministry of Environment, they have a forest biomonitoring network, and I have many heads, and that's one of them I do, and I go out and I resample some sites that were sampled in 1985, and we compared soils, and we compared foliage in sugar maple. And one thing you can see as you look that, again, remember this is at critical level, so we're okay. The more sites have got enough calcium, but definitely on average the calcium levels in foliage in 2005 were significantly lower than calcium levels in foliage in 1985.
Okay, next question.
Yes?
Is that an average of all the sites?
Yeah.
Are there some sites that are below the threshold?
Yeah, you saw that in that figure, there's two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So then this is aerized, so I don't want to get too much into soil science. If you do a soil profile, the upper soil horizon, the grey or dark black, depending on the soil type, is what we call the A horizon. That's also Canadian. A for sure. Anyway, it's a small horizon, but that's where most of the interaction with precipitation, acidity will occur, and it's also in that area here where most of the fine roots are, in terms of accessing calcium. So if you're going to see changes in soil, that's where you look, in that upper mineral horizon. Not in the LFH, not in the organic horizon, because that's recycled, not in the B horizon deeper down, because it's not interacting as much with the precipitation, and the fine roots aren't located there. So we look in the A horizon, and we see again that we saw a much bigger decrease in the A horizon. Again, thinking that this here is where that critical level is between 0.5 and 1. It's going down, but we're not there. We're not there. So that's what's happened. Lakes have gone down, soils have gone down, foliage levels have gone down. So that's answer to number 2. Number 3, what is causing that? What is causing these changes? Well, the simplest way I can do it is there's a little figure here, and I hope you follow my logic, so I apologise for those who don't follow it. Quite simply, the major reason calcium levels have changed over this period of time is acid deposition. That's the main cause. And so what you have here is, if you imagine this would have been soil, an available soil pool, let's go back to 1920, right, before it really began. And now that pool developed in that soil, it took about 12,000 years, right? Weathering processes, because prior to that there was precious little disturbance and there had been very low acid deposition levels. So we could argue that really it was reached some sort of zero. So we had quite a large pool that had built up through weathering and deposition, accumulating. That was our starting point. But don't forget, these soils are still poor. And we know they're poor because people tried farming these sites. I mean, I remember walking through one of the catchments, Hart Lake, and coming across gravestones in the middle of the forest. It was spooky, right? And the reason is that there was a settlement there in the past, and they tried to farm it, so it's all second growth. They'd cut it down, and really, after 1 or 2 years, they realised, you know, most crops don't grow in rocky, poor, nutrient-poor soils. So they were left for forest. So we know the poor soils. But nevertheless, we had a reserve of calcium that had built up in the soils. And then what happens is when you add acid to a system, anyone who knows anything from chemistry, it's just a basic titration. If you add acid, so the pH of the acidity coming in might be about 4, for example, around here. And then as that water then leaves the soil, the pH is higher. And the reason the pH is higher is because some of those acidity, or protons as we call them, have been exchanged in the soil for calcium, which buffer it. So the pH of the soil the water coming out of the soil might be about 6. And that's what you'll typically see in most lakes around here. They're somewhere around 6. And that means what's going on is that the acidity is titrating and it's taking calcium into our lakes. So that's why levels went up in our lakes. They were higher than they were in 1920. Because we're taking it out of this reserve, and the consequence for our soils, of course, is that it's going down. The relationship between all this, and if you ever, this is on a side note, why some lakes acidify and some don't, it's all really a function of how much calcium they have in the soils. Sites that don't have much calcium, in this case this red line, would follow this trajectory if you increase acidity. Compared to this one, with the same level of acidity, you have way more calcium. So this lake would not acidify anywhere near as much as this lake. So the real differences, what I believe in terms of the lakes that we see around here, are not so much due to different mineralogies. It's related to the soil pools, which comes to the depth, how much soil you have in a catchment. It becomes very, very important. So what we've seen, the change we've seen, so what's going on right now is that we're coming down this way. Acid deposition is going down. As you go from here to here, you're going down one of these trajectories. So the calcium level is going to come down just the same way. And we can document this. I took it out, a slide that shows the data, and it's identical. The R-squared is something like 0.97. While this is theoretical, the observed data show you exactly the same thing. So the majority of the change that we see in lakes, and the majority of loss in the soil calcium, has been through acid deposition leaching. So do not mistake that. Some people might argue, well, perhaps it's nothing to do with acid leaching. What's happening is weathering rates increase. You add acidity and the weathering, in other words, the long-term supply, the breakdown of minerals will increase because you've got more acidity. Well, that's not true, not in our soils. And we know this, a variety of reasons, but one of the best ways of looking at it is if you look at the silica to calcium ratio, for example. All the minerals that supply calcium in these watersheds are silicate-based minerals. Things like plagioclase and hornblende. Therefore, if we saw an increased weathering, we'd expect to see silica increase just as much, because it would be a weathering product. Likewise, we could use sodium to calcium ratio. Same thing. We see dramatic changes in these ratios, these stoichemistries, the elemental ratios, and all that's telling us basically that this excess calcium that's coming out of our watersheds and into our lakes is not because there's an increased supply in the soil. What we are doing is we are taking calcium that is in the exchange form in the soil and putting it into our lakes just by titration. So what we did then is we've done some modelling. We have Muskoka lakes here and we have some Algoma lakes there, and we did some dynamic modelling, and these are named lakes. Some of these are in Algonquin, And all we're trying to show here is that we have lake calcium levels in 1850, which we predict. I wasn't around in 1850. And then we compare them to present. So for each lake we have the pre-industrial, or 1850, and the present. And you can see that for all the lakes, according to our geochemical models and our understanding of calcium biogeochemistry, the current calcium levels in lakes are higher than they would have been in 1850. So again, what we're doing in sense of the observations with the stream and the lakes is, yeah, we're going down, but we're going down because we've got less acid, and ultimately we can't sustain that high level anyway because we'll just bleed the soils dry. We have to go back down, and ultimately we'd expect to go back to some pseudo steady state, and our levels in lakes would approach what they were pre-industrially. So that's calcium biogeochemistry. Hopefully everyone's still with me, and everyone's still following the main thing. So we have this story that calcium levels are changing in lakes, they're going down. That change is ultimately or primarily brought about by acid deposition changes. If you get more acid, more calcium goes from soils into lakes. As acid deposition goes down, less calcium goes from soils into lakes. Right now, we still have more acidity than we had in 1850. We still have more calcium in lakes than we would have expected. So calcium levels have to go down in lakes. They have to go to what they were. It can't sustain the higher levels unless we get a new source. So that's where we're at. So then the question is, well, okay, that assumes this scenario here, where we have the only sources of calcium to my watershed are from deposition, from rainfall, and this weathering thing that I've talked about, this breakdown of minerals that were present in soils. And ultimately, and I tried to be very clever here, the thickness of that arrow and the thickness of that arrow would equal the thickness of that arrow. You'd be in a steady state. And therefore, that determines ultimately the calcium concentration in your lake. So this value really doesn't change too much in the region. There is some differences, as you'll see. It doesn't change much. The real determinant of lake calcium levels is this value here. In some catchments you have more weathering, therefore you'll have more calcium going into lakes. And in some catchments you'll have less weathering, less calcium into lakes. And that's just natural state, and that's what we would get to if we did not touch the forests. However, if we do touch the forests, and this is I never was an artist. It's pretty good, right, considering I couldn't find slash in clip art. We have this other scenario here that we have. So the assumption is, look, calcium deposition has not changed. Still, there's no reason. It has slightly, but we'll go there. Weathering doesn't change, as I showed you. The silica calcium ratios have changed. If there was a change in weathering with changes in concentration, that ratio should stay constant. It didn't. So we know that's not changing. But we have this extra little arrow over here. Remember my calciocentric eyes when I'm walking through the forest? There's calcium in the bark and the calcium in wood. And we are taking that away from sight. Therefore, I have to balance my book. It's like any bank. If I'm taking some away here, the only way I can do that is by making this arrow a little smaller. Because this pool, at some point, has to be in steady state. I cannot keep taking from it. I'll have nothing left. So the concern, or the issue we're trying to address here is, well, what will the difference between this arrow and this arrow be in the landscape? Because that ultimately is the effect of timber harvesting on lake calcium levels. That is what we're trying to get at. Does everybody follow that one? Yeah? Anyone want to copy this diagram?
No, but should the tree not have a calcium deposit into the soil?
Anything internal I don't include. So there's lots of internal cycling all the time, but like there is here, trees die, litter fall. For this, but that is not a net input or a net loss to system, so we don't need to worry about that. Anything that's internal system. So yeah, there's lots of internal cycles.
But you have the tree removal in that side, but not on that.
Yeah, this is on the harvested side. This is a natural. So this tree will die, but you keep recycling, right? Nothing gets taken away from side. In this one, it's notice I said calcium removed from side in any way, shape, or form. If you take away, I mean, people in Hubbard Brook have even looked at the effect of deer hunt on calcium levels in forests, because deer, the bones, actually contain so much calcium. They've done the study based on deer density and mass and that, and worked out how much calcium is lost from sight in deer. But that's another story. I'm not going there. But believe me, they've done it. So what we're trying to do then is in the landscape, as best we can, try and answer this question: how big is this arrow? where does it occur in the landscape, and relative to what here, what will the relative change be? And from that, start saying, does it matter? Does it have any serious consequence or any potential consequence? So this is where we're coming to, and this is like the work in progress right now. So I'm really, in some ways, still in. If you notice, none of these are Carolyn. But these are other guys. These are like tough guys in the bush. And this is Nora keeping them all in check. This is a story anyway. But the reason is actually, and I'll tell you why there's no picture of Carolyn here, because Carolyn has yet to see a site that's been harvested. She was hoping to get out yesterday, but she kept talking too long and we never got out of that. So what we're trying to do is then answer that question using existing data and help from folk in this room, where we can, based on their knowledge, people out in the field, and what they observe, allowing us as scientists to come up with the most reasonable number that is plausible. So we're just simply going to do a mass balance for all the lakes that we can get data for. And ultimately, what we're trying to do from this perspective is work out how much calcium in the landscape is removed from site. And that ultimately becomes this number here. Once we have that, and we can estimate weathering rates using lake chemistry, I'm not going to go into that. We have deposition, which we can get from Environment Canada. We have runoff. We can make some predictions on what lake calcium levels will be under this harvest scenario that we have. So in some ways it's very simple. It's just basically a mass balance with 4 numbers. X plus X minus Y minus Z or something like that. It's really not very complicated. The challenge, of course, is getting these numbers. So, the Muskoka River Watershed. So I can't tell you what we are doing and what we can't do or not doing right now, just so that you're all fully aware where we stand. First of all, about half the area is Crown land. So we are doing nothing on private land. That doesn't mean that nothing happens on private land. It's that we don't know what goes on, and there's no way we can get data. If we can't get data, there's no point even trying this. So what we're doing is we're going to do this study on the lakes that we have data to, and there's no reason that the lakes that we select are any different than lakes that are on private land, beyond the fact that they are in this area and private land's over here. So the process should be the same. But we're not going to extrapolate out, because we don't know what's going on here right now. We're just going to be dealing with the lake catchments and making estimates for those lakes that we have data. So we're working with basically Westman and Algonquin, providing us information on where, because we in the past after the study we used to start with hypothetical, and what we've done is we said, okay, here's our lakes. We'll across the board we'll apply this scenario, and we harvest the entire catchment, and with a theoretical harvest removal, and said this is what the potential consequence could be. And it was fine to show the potential, but it really doesn't reflect reality. What Carolyn will do, hopefully, is this is reality. This is the best we get at knowing what the true effect of timber harvesting will be on lake calcium levels. So it's using site-specific data that we can get information for. Just to again give you, so I think, I think we had about 900 lakes that we have lake chemistry data for. So that's our target population. We had 900 lakes that we're going to try and do this study for. And then Carolyn went through it, and of those 900, only 590 of them were on Crown land. So that was our sample set. We just threw away we didn't throw away because we ignored them for now, because we don't know what's going on in the catchments of those sites. And some landowners are very receptive and would like you to know, others will just chase you off with a gun. So we tend to, all depends on who you're talking to. So then of those data set, 590, most of them, about 570, have calcium levels that are less than 4.5. So again, why 4.5 milligrams? It's quite simple why these numbers come up. First of all, any lake that has calcium levels greater than 4.5 is not at risk. It's got so much calcium, any disturbance in the landscape is not going to change it and send it anywhere near the thresholds that Norm would indicate of around 1.5 milligram per litre. Just won't happen. Also, these lakes may well have a different mineralogy. They may have a greater proportion of minerals like calcite or apatite, which are not silicate minerals, and therefore the approach that we're using to calculate weathering is based entirely on the assumption that calcium weathering comes from silicate-based minerals. So it wouldn't work. So all of a sudden now I study lakes, population set is down to about 570 lakes. And then of those 570, about 370 have cuts or are predicted. This is from the database that we're expecting for. So over this decade, 370 of the 570 or so that we have data for are scheduled to have some level of harvesting in those catchments. So the idea is, what we'll try and do is, for those sites, we'll estimate, based on the information we can get, how much calcium will be removed in the long term, and throw those numbers in the mass balance and say, okay, for these lakes, what is the potential impact of that level of harvesting that we come up with? To give you an idea of the calcium levels in lakes that we have right now, this is the entire 570 or so lakes that are on Crown land. The average concentration is about 2.4, just to put in perspective where we're at. Of the cut catchments, the ones that are scheduled to be harvested, it's pretty much a subset. It's not biased in any way. It's not any different. So it's a little bit low mean, but that's just a virtual sampling. It really is just representative of the lakes. The lake's not being chosen anyway. But that's the data set we're going to be using. So this study will allow us to say what may happen in these catchments. We are not going to attempt as part of this study to then extrapolate across the Muskoka River watershed. We talked about deposition. So what we have here is basically a deposition map that we've got from Americana. So over here is around about 4 kilograms of calcium, and down here you can get to 5 or 6 kilograms. So that rainfall can add quite a lot of calcium to our forests, and it's an important thing. So we have this now, so we can delineate catchments, and we have a rainfall contribution of calcium. Runoff, which we need ultimately to calculate weathering rate, as you'll see. We also have for all the catchments, and again it's a little bit higher in the northern part, the northeast one here, compared to the southwest, very climate. So the data that we have the lake data, we have the runoff data, we have deposition, we have everything we need to do the mass balance, except the removals. And we had a meeting yesterday about how we're going to do this, and I think we now have a path forward. This is just one that a figure that Carolyn showed together. That shows just the forest composition. But ultimately what we're going to do is, for each of these catchments, we're going to come up with an idea, well, what proportion of the catchment has been harvested, what is the volume that will be harvested, and how often will that volume be taken away. If we know the concentration of calcium in wood and bark, we can start to do a mass balance for each and every catchment. And that's the only bit that Carolyn has to do, and she has to defend her masters in May. So not putting her on the spot, but that's the time frame. So that's so what I've done is I thought, okay, hopefully you understand what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to do for all the lakes that we have data for in this catchment. But it probably you're still okay. So what does that mean? What do you mean? So what I try to do now is say, okay, based on my experience, I'll put together an example of how a mass balance will be done and the type of values and effects or change that you may see. So it's a bit of math, but not too much. And again, it's just an example to show how these things do. And then anything, if you assume more is removed, then the effect will be greater. If you assume less is removed, then the effect will be less, right? And so once we get these numbers, then we can do it. So all we need to know is, in this example, I'm saying, okay, we have a catchment that we have laid data for, where 30 cubic meters was removed. I chose that number, and the assumption is, well, that's 25-year rotation. Maybe 30, and we can change it based on conversations, or maybe 15, whatever it is. That might be 15, it may be 40, it all depends where they are. And then we'll assume that in that catchment, only 60% of it actually gets cut, 40% of it. So again, we have to work with people involved, because we know not all catchments are cut. There are areas left for a variety of reasons, and we need to best quantify what areas actually cut before we do that. So this scenario that I'm doing here is saying we have 30 meters cubed, 60%. Is everybody with that scenario? So assumption, so we need to know, the only thing we need to know in terms of the forest are, well, what is the wood concentration and what is the bark concentration? Well, I've sampled in core enough trees in this area to know that typically, and this is sugar maple, that the concentration of calcium in sugar maple wood is about 1 gram per kilogram. Right, we know that, and the bark is about 30 grams. It's about 30 times higher. There's a lot more calcium in bark than there is in wood. In terms of biomass, again, using allometric equations, it is dependent on which height, but you can, again, making the assumption that in a bowl, 9% of the mass is wood and 10% is bark. Now again, that will change based on the size of the tree. You know, small diameter trees will have a greater proportion of bark, larger diameter trees will have less. I mean, so again, we can play around in a sense of these, but this is the assumption that I made for this example. So if you plug all these numbers into a sum, a math, what it means that we've removed 46 kilograms of calcium. That's how much we took away in this hypothetical harvest from 60%, and we do that every 25 years. So you just do the math, you say, okay, multiply this by 0.6, divide by 25, and what that means is that about a kilogram, that's how much it's getting me, that's all. 1 kilogram of calcium per head, that's equivalent, for that scenario, that is what it were, or a bag of sugar. That's how much calcium there is. In 1 hectare, for those of you who know, a hectare is just 100 meters by 100 meters. That's the area of a catchment. So we're losing the equivalent of a bag of sugar worth of calcium in an entire hectare per year due to harvesting. And that's how numbers would work. So, okay, what does that mean for lake calcium concentration? So, what we can say is, okay, if we have, and it's right underneath here, if you actually have a lake where the runoff, in this case, is 340 millimeters, right, what you'll can do is, well, you can divide that amount of calcium by that runoff, and what that'll mean is that if that catchment, this one here, was harvested at that intensity, in perpetuity, the calcium level in that lake would be 0.3 milligrams per litre lower than it would have been otherwise. That, for that lake, is the effect of timber harvesting under that scenario. What does that mean? Well, it all depends on where you are. If your lake is up here, and you're going to lose 0.3, it probably doesn't matter. It's not going to affect. If your lake is down here, then it may have more of a consequence. So that is why we need to be able to put this kind of information on a spatial distribution so that we can match up these changes to the lakes. And again, my expectancy is that lakes that have low calcium will typically have poor soils. And if they have poor soils, like it is, that yields are going to be lower. That's the way you'd expect it. So that you may end up that sites that are low in calcium have very low calcium removals anyway because the forest soils don't support it. That's what we'll see. But that is what we get. So, to the end. Remember, Ed, this is the exam. Luckily, I'm very bad. I always give the answers in my exam questions. So here we are. So the answers to my exam here, and going back to the beginning, are, well, why should we care about calcium environment? And the answer for 1 mark would be, well, it's an essential nutrient and it's required in large amounts. And that's key. It's required in large amounts by biota, plants and animals. How are calcium levels in lakes, vegetation soils changing? That's quite simple. We're going down. Pretty much across the board. What is causing these changes? Well, it's primarily the rate of change, the degree of change, the magnitude of change that we have seen is due to acid deposition changes. It's acid deposition that has leached calcium from the soils, is the change in acidity that is changing the calcium levels in lakes overwhelmingly. However, what will be the impact of timber harvest on soil? Ultimately, if you harvest a site, because you are taking some calcium away from sites, that calcium level in that lake will be lower than it would be otherwise. Whether that has any effect will depend at what stage or what is the level of calcium in that lake. And that's, I have no answers for that right now, because until we do this part of the work, I don't know on the landscape what the results of these mass balances will be. Plugs for my next proposals. Critical uncertainties. One of the things that I've done here is I've simplified calcium biogeochemistry, and in the sense that all this assumes that calcium availability to trees is coming from this exchangeable soil pool, and therefore it competes with acidity, if you like, for a given reserve. And to a large degree we know that's true. There would be no relationship between soil calcium and foliar calcium if that was not the case. So we know that's kind of true. There are some studies out there that will tell you that trees can mine minerals, and mycorrhizae, fungi that are attached to roots, certainly contribute to weathering. But I believe we capture that in our weathering calculations. I don't think we can add an additional source that trees can mine. However, I am working on that using isotopes. We can use some fancy geochemical techniques, and hopefully in a year or two from now I'll be able to say, look, they're not accessing any other source apart from the exchangeable source, categorically. But that's where we're at. You know, I give a concentration in there for this mass balance. Now I know calcium levels can change, right? We saw that in the figures. So, you know, theoretically, what will happen as calcium levels go down in soils, calcium levels in trees will go down. So perhaps I can refine my removals by taking into account the fact that calcium levels in wood and bark will go down. How low will they go? Well, I don't think they can go below a certain critical threshold. Now, for wood, I've never seen calcium levels in sugar maple wood less than 600-700 parts per million, and those are very poor, so you wouldn't want to go that low. A real key uncertainty is bark. No one does much work on bark. In the mass balance, even though it's only stop-sorted, 2/3 of the calcium that is removed in stems is taken away in tree bark. 2/3. If we know better, will that change? Now, then we can better refine our estimates, our calculations. Weathering rate estimates, I think I've done enough work on that now to say that our weathering estimates are fairly reliable. As good as you're going to get, given the fact that we're dealing with a real-world heterogeneous environment. By what Carolyn's doing, by focusing on lakes, we don't have to worry about the heterogeneity in soils. And we're not worried about, we're not asking a question, is our trees going to continue to grow as well? That's not what we're asking, and the assumption is they will, right? But we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with light, and I think, yeah, there is some uncertainty weathering, but it's relatively low. This is norm. What are the calcium levels in lakes? I think he's done enough experiments with his Daphnia to kill them and knows what kills them. Perhaps bigger question is, what does this mean at the ecosystem level? Just because you lose a few Daphnia, who cares? Right? I don't know, Norm stands up infuriated at this point. However, I mean, you know, it's a valid question. What happened? I mean, I think there's room for those uncertainties. What does that mean? Perhaps Norm knows, or perhaps not. I'm putting it as I don't know what it means. Time. Question mark. This always reminds me of cutting trees up at Cochrane Lake, and it was pouring down in November, and it was sleeting down, and I was with a master's student, and we were cutting jack pine trees, and we're bitter cold, and all we kept singing was this song by the Rolling Stones. Time is on my side, and it really wasn't. However, a key thing is, everything I've told you, I've not mentioned time. I've not mentioned when levels in lakes will reach these values. And I don't know yet. What we're doing right now is a preliminary assessment. It's a broad-scale assessment, and we're going to identify areas that, given the scenarios at hand, are at risk. Then what I advise is that, okay, given that these are the lakes that are potentially most at risk, let's go into these sites, into these catchments, get the data that we need. And we have the models, we have the knowledge to predict the effect of time. It's the data we don't have. And we need to generate the data if there's a need. If it turns out from this study that really the effect of harvesting is minimal, then you could argue you don't need to go that far. If it turns out that there are a subset of sensitive systems and people are concerned, well, let's go in there. Because if we're not going to see these changes for 200 years, then perhaps time, as the Rolling Stones said, is on your side. If it's going to be in 30 years, you know, then it isn't. And that, as I say, is that. I should point out that, really, I mean, I'm just a spokesperson here. All the work, the hard work, as I always tell my classes, whenever you come to a problem, the first thing you do is find a student. and let them do the work. But really, lots of people who generate a lot of this data. I kind of try and keep them in check somewhat. And of course, the MOE have been huge partners for my research over the last decade. Canadian Water Network and NSERC, Americana, I shouldn't say the CFS now, I don't think they exist, NRCan, I suppose, is what they're kind, for helping all these studies that have gone into this talk. Thank you.
I'm sure there are no questions out there, but let's see.
Yeah.
I'm not much of a scientist, but I didn't hear anything about forest fires and the effect that might have on the soil that affect the calcium levels.
Right. I actually had a question. I mean, first of all, in this region, the idea is that forest fires aren't a major player. You know, we don't really have that many forest fires. What would happen, and I've seen this in work I've done in the experimental lakes area in northwestern Ontario. If you have a forest fire, the temperature that most fires burn at is not high enough to volatilize calcium. Essentially, you fertilize the forest soil. So in the ALA, we're monitoring the streams. What happened after the fire is you got an increase in calcium. It was the same as that ash, like wood ash to the forest, and you got this fertilizer effect. So that is essentially the effect of the fire. But we don't really have much fires around here to worry about. Yeah.
Sean, what about the feasibility of replacing the calcium you take out in the logging practices? Keeping the slash, keeping the bark in the forest, take the logs out. Historically, the bark has always been thrown away. Now they're using most of it, I think, using it in mulch and whatnot. But if they changed their practices and left bark in,
I would say if and this is if you did harvest and you left the bark, you would reduce the impact enormously, because the amount of calcium that you actually take away in wood relative to the bark is small.
Yeah.
Mechanistically and practically, how you would ever do that, that's where the issue is, right? That's a scientific answer for sure, right? That definitely is a sign that leave the bark, you don't use it, right, or whatever, or it's not as important to you. Leave it, and then you can, but practically on the field, if you're doing this, I don't know of anywhere really. I mean, I've heard rumours that in Scandinavia, they're talking about doing that, but really I've not seen evidence of it. And you'd have to talk to somebody who actually works in these things to see if it really is feasible.
well, I understand that Westwind is a big player in the industry in this area, and that they're very much scientifically based. Evidence, they do listen to evidence,
Yeah.
and they must be a major player.
Yeah.
Getting them to convince their loggers to leave some of this slash behind, it may be just a political sort of push. If you want the tract of land to harvest, you will leave a certain percentage of that bark behind.
Yeah, I mean, what you might end up doing is, you can present this anyway. The other way you could do it is, so look, if I have lakes that are high calcium levels, I don't care. You don't need to worry about it, right? You can take away the bark. It's never going to drive it to a critical threshold. It's the lakes that are on this borderline sensitive where that worry about it. So what you could argue then is, if you're going to harvest an area and you know that lake and you have some idea of what its chemistry is, then perhaps what you should do is either, as you said, or you could just add wood ash. I mean, that's the other. You just replace it. I don't know which would be cheaper. I mean, you saw it's a bag of sugar a hectare per year. That's the mass of calcium that's being lost, right? It's not like you have to add tons of the stuff. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better to reduce acid rain precipitation levels?
That would only be the acid rain thing would only give you temporally changes in the next decade. Ultimately, what I'm looking at is steady state. And the idea is that there was no acid deposition in this budget because you have a reserve in the soil and you only have two sources, weathering and deposition, and you have a leaching loss. Right? Ultimately, all acid deposition is shifts it from one pool to the other quicker or slower. It doesn't change the end product. All I'm looking at is the end product. I'm not looking about the time, and that's where acid deposition would affect how quickly you go from this level to this level. It won't change the ultimate end value in the lake. Yeah?
In one of your previous slides, you mentioned, I think, the expected amount that would be the calcium that would be lost based on certain, I suppose, maybe on scaling of logs and that sort of thing. that been followed through as logging techniques have changed? Going from, for instance, log length to tree length and taking into account added value products, which is other gentlemen just mentioned?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you could argue, I mean, other people tapping trees, for example, right? If you were to start going at that level, so well, you take away a lot of sap, right? And you might think, if you actually work out how much sap and you add up the amount of calcium that you take away in sap, it gets to, 0.2, 0.3 per kilogram per hectare. This timber house is 1 kilogram, right? So there's other things that I'm not considering that can contribute to lot. Remember, I said calcium removed from site. And my figure showed a log going away, but you can remove calcium in other ways. And ultimately, you should consider all sources. And right now, we're just taking a very simplistic approach and just taking timber housed in as logs, and we're just going off volume data because that's all we have. Without that, we can only work with the information that we have. We can speculate and say, well, in the video there isn't, but right now, I mean, it's kind of sequential. It builds on, and I'm just sticking with this. But we've done stuff with maple and stuff, and they said the deer. There's been lots of other things that can potentially lose calcium from your sites that, while in themselves are small, but if you add them together, and they start to become more meaningful, perhaps. Yep.
Oh, just to add to the gentleman that talked over here on the logging. I'm from Westwind, as you know, and so the operators at Point right now, they bring just the boles of the tree out. They don't bring the whole tree out because we don't allow full tree logging because that would ruin the rest of the trees because it's a partial logging system. It's not clear cutting. So the bark stays on those boles, of course, because it's cheaper to take it to the mill and use a debarking machine at the mill. To bring a debarking machine into a forest would be pretty expensive. So that's one thing. We don't take the trees out full length because that doesn't happen. But what we're doing is we're working with Sean and Carolyn on the catchment areas. Is there areas that are lower in calcium and higher, and figure out how much are we taking out around those lakes, and we'll see how that works. And yeah, there probably should be some technology in the future that might be able to put something back into the forest. But
you're in the forest anyways. Why not just take some calcium in with you and spread it around in some form that's going?
We could do that, but that's an expense. But we have to look at how does that affect the lakes in around, and how much is coming out of around that catchment area. Is that affecting that lake at all? Do we spend the money on that, or do we wait and see where there's really low calcium lakes in through there? And maybe as I think you said, Sean, there may not be a harvest there at all anyway because of the weathering, and there's no force to harvest because of the rock or whatever. So these are things we'll look at with Carolyn with her stuff. Both our forest, Westwind and the Algonquin forestry folks, Gord's at the back here, are going to feed data into Carolyn's study. So I would like to see over the time when you do your study, we'd have another presentation of it in the spring when you're done.
Yes. In May.
We should have mentioned too that we're getting enormous cooperation from both Algonquin Forest Authority and from Westman on this project, and I couldn't possibly do it without their cooperation. So.
Sean, just a quick question. Calcium levels in our lakes are changing really so fast that you'll be using the recent Canadian Water Network calcium data, and because I don't know where the 500 lakes come from, but if it's 10-year-old data, it's probably off by 20%.
It doesn't matter for what we're using it for, because we're using it to calculate weathering rate, which is a constant, right? So everything's relative to the time we have that number. So, but it wouldn't. The weathering rate shouldn't change.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Sean, one thing that we've talked about before is how the paleo data sometimes suggests that lakes may be actually below historical concentrations because the biological assemblage was never at the levels it is now. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that a change in forest composition from maybe a white pine dominated forest to a mixed hardwood could have, because the biogeochemical models suggest that the lakes are higher than now, but does that assume a constant composition in the forest?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were going to work on, perhaps it will get done at some point, was to answer this question: why calcium, and which is a reasonable question. Most acidification models lump magnesium and calcium together the way they behave, but what's happened is in our system, calcium changing much more so than magnesium, and so trying to reconcile that. And the reason I believe it is because of the forest. what happens is trees have a much higher demand for calcium than they do for magnesium, relatively speaking, relative to the sources, i.e. weathering or deposition. So if you have a hardwood forest, a hardwood forest tree cycles a lot of calcium, much more than that. And what that'll do is that'll throw litter onto the ground, that'll break down, and what you'll end up is enriching the soil. So what could happen in that scenario is you could end up holding calcium back into the soil to build up a soil reserve by changing from a pine forest to a maple forest. So none of the geochemical models factor that in right now. That's one of the things we were going to try and work on. It's in progress. It's one of those critical uncertainties. So you'll get the proposal on your desk next week. Yeah.
Is there any other critical nutrients that we should be monitoring? You know, I started with acid rain years ago, and calcium was not on the radar. It was almost by fluke luck that we just stumbled across the calcium decline.
Yeah.
But what about any other base cations or anions that are we should be monitoring, or that we might be at critical levels now as well?
I mean, the interesting thing is the nutrients that you would normally, you all gardeners, you all know NPK, right? They're your three plant nutrients. Now, right now we're doing a global nitrogen fertilization study through farming and automobiles. There's way more nitrogen coming into our system than there ever has been before. So we're not really nitrogen limited, right? So nitrogen's, if anything, we could be getting too much of it. That's one of it. So then we're left with potassium and phosphorus. Now, those two elements, just like nitrogen, are very, very tightly cycled in a forest system, in a plant system. So you start in leaves this time of year. Calcium, magnesium, the concentration in leaves doesn't change. So all the calcium, magnesium stays in the leaves, and those leaves fall to the ground. It's just cycled. Trees will get it from the soil next year. With potassium and phosphorus, trees take about 70% of that back, because when it hits the soil, those elements are not strongly retained in the soil, and they are leached out. So if you were then to do a study about that, and you would just do a mass balance of something like potassium, you would say, well, potassium's at risk. But trees have much greater control over potassium. They can conserve it themselves. They can thrive. So it's probably okay. The concern you may have with that, and same with phosphorus, is if you harvest, because you're disrupting that, and we can lose that. So from a harvest perspective, I would say phosphorus and potassium. We've done phosphorus budgets, even under harvesting scenarios, and we always find that our budgets are positive. In other words, we have more phosphorus coming in precipitation than we have leaving into our lakes. And that's always perplexed me. It shouldn't happen, but where's that phosphorus going? Right, you can't. And so what we're doing right now, and we have a student just started, is my belief is that our phosphorus deposition numbers are wrong. And we've had students this summer looking at the rainfall samples at Watershed, looking at pollen grains. There's a lot of pollen in that, and we look at it because these are open, they collect pollen, and you can see in June when white pine come out, you can see them all there. Pollen is very enriched in phosphorus. And that pollen is just an internal cycle. So what we're doing is we're actually overestimating the actual amount of phosphorus that's coming into our forests. So the hope is that in a year or a year and a half from now, when this student finishes, we'll have a much better input of phosphorus. And that then will allow us to answer the question as to whether there's a potential risk of phosphorus. Because right now, using the information we have would suggest there's no risk at all. But my instinct and feeling and observations are that actually it's because we're overestimating the deposition. And most of that phosphorus, what we're measuring at the collectors, is just pollen being blown around. Yeah?
Just wondering if you could define for me a little bit better, you talked about steady state a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of think of steady state, sort of what's coming in is the same that's going out in a steady format. And I kind of wonder, is that really a natural thing? Take logging out of it, take even a whole bunch of, take the acid rain out of it. Is that?
It's a relative term in the sense that it'll never be completely constant, but it won't be changing as much as we're seeing right now. Right? So right now we've observed changes, 60% calcium in lakes. What will happen is, if I could go forward in time for the next, say, 50 years from now, and acid deposition levels never changed, or they went down, I mean, actually, let's assume they didn't change. Let's go over that. What will happen is calcium levels will go down a little bit further, and then they pretty much hover around a certain time. And that level will be dictated solely, they will balance the amount of weathering and the amount of deposition. Pretty much close to. There's year-to-year fluctuations because of climate, because of difference in runoff, but you know, you're talking relatively small blips, and that's what I mean by steady state. As opposed to, it's reached equilibrium. And you know, you can get, in a particular catchment, you can get internal disturbance events, and that will go so there. But the idea is, in the long term, it'll keep going back to this same number. That's the steady state number that I mean. It's not something that is, we reach 2 million depleted and it will never change. It won't, because there's always something that goes in the forest, and so it might go to 2.2, but it'll come back, it'll keep going. That's the steady state number that we're predicting, if you understand.
But why would it stay steady state with, I mean, our acid deposition, our acid levels are higher still now than, a lot better than they were 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But they're still higher than the natural.
What it means is the water will be more acidic.
Yeah.
That's
So
what it means than it would have been. So instead of calcium buffering it, it's protons. That's what will happen, right? So the pH of the water will be lower than it was. The calcium level will be the same, but because you've got more sulfate, it'll be more acidic. That's what will happen. Because your soil is a finite pool. You can't keep taking from it. Right now we're taking from it. Ultimately, it's like your bank account, right? You have 50 bucks in, right? You want to stay at 50 bucks, right? If you put in 5 in, you can only take 5 out, right? And so it's just the same thing with your soil. You have a finite pool. You can't continue to take 7 bucks out if you only put in 5 in. Ultimately, you have to go back to those 5 bucks. You might sustain it for a little while, and you drive your bank account down, but at some point you're going to reach, like, you can't go any lower.
I want to hit you up a bit at the time frame as well. I'm really struggling with that, the time, and I know there's some point in time where things have an impact.
Yeah.
But I look at logging. So when that tree, with your picture of that tree was removed, generally the trees that are being removed, the calcium is held. It's not available, right? When it's in the bark, it's in the wood. It's not available to the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And the trees that are cut, they tend to be, most of them weren't going to start delivering that back to the soil naturally for quite some period of time. You know, it has to blow down, die, then fall down onto the ground, then start. So there's a long time frame. I guess I'm sort of thinking, like, so the logging, that 0.3, that doesn't really maybe come into effect until X number of years down the road.
Yeah, exactly right. So what you would do in that sense, so saying these are all our lakes, what we're going to do now. So this is, we have a 30-year time period. And what we're then interested in, okay, that's what's happened, right? What we're interested in is somewhere over here, somewhere by the door, right? Whatever it is, right? We want to see what's going to happen in the future. So if you then were to compare these catchments with and without harvesting, for the initial decade, 20, 30 years, you won't see a difference. Over time, they'll start to diverge. And the one with the harvesting will go slightly lower, because that has driven the soil calcium level down, and it's that different. Ultimately, by the time you get to the door, or wherever it is in the future, that's where that difference arises. And that's where the time thing comes in. And so that's what we're trying. I don't know how long that is right now. There are models that exist there that, if we have more data, will allow us to make some estimates of this.
Thank you, Sean.